The Nigerian government has introduced a new electricity distribution policy called willing seller, willing buyer. Now, this policy is expected to bypass middlemen and sell power directly to consumers. With this new policy, electricity will now be wheeled directly from the generation companies to consumers who are ready to settle their bills. Minister of Power Salim Ahmad believes this development will save energy losses in the sector and assist Gencos who have not been getting full payments for generated power. The policy has begun as a pilot scheme in 2 states. Let's talk more. An energy expert, Michael Oluwagbemi, joins me from our Abuja studios. Glad to have you join us, Mr. Oluwagbemi, this afternoon.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Oluwagbemi, I want to start this way. I was waiting for this because I knew that there's been a lot of issues surrounding the discos, talking about rejection of power and other issues affecting them. Now, this has come up. Minister is saying, willing buyer, willing seller approach. How does this come to you?
Well, I need to first of all try to clear some misconception about this policy. First, the policy itself was, the policy statement itself was already announced by the National Electric Regulatory Commission as of last year. It was the details of the eligible customer, the willing buyer, willing seller policy was published late last year on the NERC website for public inputs and public comments. The Vice President on January 29, 2019, during the campaign, actually went into the details of how the willing buyer, willing seller will work. In addition to this, the reality is that the willing buyer, willing seller is only for a particular class of consumer. It is not for every consumer. It's not as if Ada, Obi, or Musa or Adioye in their house can just suddenly start buying directly from Sapele Gas and Power or from Geregu, as the case may be. What this policy actually enables is for customers of a certain size, which is determined by, I believe, is about 1 megawatt and above of clustered power, can access or buy power directly from Gencos. So what this means is that, one, you must either be an industrial customer or you must be a customer that have been organized into clusters, and then these clusters approach, for example, if you live in a large housing estate or you live in a large area within an urban city, you can then have someone represent you as a cooperative, and then you can approach the Gencos to be supplied power directly. This, of course, can solve two issues. One, it can resolve the issue of power rejection and power reliability. So when you go ahead, let's say for your housing estate or you're an industrial estate or you're an industrial cluster, if you approach the Genco, you can have a kind of a reliability contract that says you must supply me power 24 hours a day for me to be to enable me to pay you your tariff on time. So, and the Genco will then hold themselves to this higher standard and then supply you that power 24 hours a day. So it can resolve that problem. It can also resolve the problem of the discos having poor equipment or poor ability to be able to absorb power that is being sent to them by Gencos, and Gencos thereby bearing the brunt of not being able to get 100% of their tariff. In this instance, the Gencos can identify clusters across the country and then supply those clusters directly, thereby bypassing the disco equipment or field equipment, as the case may be, and the discos can then deal with the power that they have the capacity to distribute. However, as I've already mentioned to you, it will still fall within the constraint of the reality of infrastructure available. For example, if you have a Genco customer or an eligible customer that is eligible for this willing buyer, willing taker arrangement, if you're out somewhere where only the disco equipment or only the disco line is available to convey that power to them, ultimately the Genco will still have to involve the discos in conveying power for the last mile. Also, even if they are nearby, say, a 3 kV power line where they can tap that power directly, they will still be constrained by the reality of having to step down power for use that they are within their locality. So in some ways or form, they will still have to be either involve NEMSA or one of the discos within their area. But again, it is a step in the right direction. It enables the market to operate in a better way. It introduces flexibility, as the case may be, but it will not completely solve all the problem for the everyday consumer.
Mr. Michael, indeed, solving the power of a country of more than 200 million people with less than 4,000 megawatts is nothing to go by. We know there's a lot needs to be done. My next question is in two folds. Now, we've heard of the issues around Ariaria Market, Sura Market in Lagos, also in Kano State, where we had a little process for traders to be able to get off the grid. Now, to me, this is not really good news for the discos. I don't know if that comes to you that same way. Then number two, how well do we see this playing out, moving on, the cooperation? What do you expect? Are you sure there's not going to be any breakup in that value chain? That chain from generation, transmission, and distribution with all of these new policies?
Yeah, well, as I've always said on this program, the discos are the only ones that have themselves to blame. They have a unique business model, probably the only business model in the world where you do not even pay for what you produce. You are only charged with distributing something that you don't produce and you don't pay for. And then you are asked to collect the money back and send the money to the person that actually produced the stuff. And then yet, you complain day in, day out that you are unable to remit 100% of what you are charged to distribute. This is the only, is really a free business model. It's an unbelievable business model for any businessman. You are distributing what you don't produce, and you don't pay for it up front. You are charged with just distributing it, collecting the money back, and keeping, say, 10%, and remitting the rest to the person that actually produced it. And you're under a regulated regime, and yet they could not achieve it. The best any disco in Nigeria achieved, I believe, during this regime has been maybe 50 to 60%. Most of them do not even remit anything at all. Some of them remit 10%, some of them remit 15%. So they are the ones that have themselves to blame. The fact that Nigeria now has to look for other alternative models to getting money from the consumer in order to ensure that the sector have liquidity. So this policy is aimed at introducing some level of liquidity, because if the Gencos are not liquid, then they will not invest to expand the current 4,000 to 7,000 megawatts that is being produced, so that we can have more power for this country that requires about 40,000 to 50,000 to even stabilize. This is not enough. 40 to 50,000 megawatts is not even enough. It's just to stabilize the country. But they won't be able to raise the current production from 7,000 to 40,000 if of that 7,000 they're only getting paid for 3,000 or 2,000, which has been the case under the regime where the discos have already turned themselves to the Lord and Manor. The discos are basically folks that have been invited to the table to eat. And when instead of eating and observing the table manners, they've destroyed the table, scattered the table, and refused to even observe the table manners of the table. And so in this instance, where the regulator, who is the guy, the canteen guy, the caterer, is insisting that if you are not going to obey the rules of this table, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find alternative tables for people to go and eat at. And then we're going to leave you at this table where you're going to be eating in the manner that you like, and at the end of the day, you might not get any food at all. So this is the case, what we are dealing with today. As far as I'm concerned, traders, industrial customers, consumers themselves have every reason to protest what the discos are doing to this economy. And I've always insisted, as I've always said on this program before, that the NERC owes it to the Nigerian consumer to defend them and to ensure we provide alternative means for them to get power. This is only one step in the right direction. I believe there needs to be more needs to be done. I understand the discos are now working with the federal government and trying to see how they can invest in their facility. But if the federal government is continuing to subsidize their activity, either by paying Siemens directly or by giving them over 1.3 million trillion in subsidy directly, then why are they owned by private individuals? The federal government is only a 40% owner of the discos. Maybe what we need to do is to convert these debts to equity, and then we can become owners of the discos. We used to be their owners anyway before. We should get our companies back. These companies should stop flying overseas, enjoying international tour on the dole of the taxpayer, as well as the inconvenience of the consumer. So I think it's high time that the federal government stand up for Nigerian consumers through the NERC, and I'm glad that the minister is doing this and is encouraging this to be done. We don't need a pilot, we need a full-blown implementation across the 36 states. Let every eligible customer, and that will even introduce a new business. Any businessman listening to me now, there's a new business where you can go to estates, you can go and cluster them, and then you can approach a Genco. There are new businesses, new business ideas are going to be introduced, and then let's liberalize and regulate the sector. That's what we need.
Mr. Michael Luagwemi, I can see the passion there. Energy experts. I think we're going to get a day to really sit down and look at the privatization process like we did at the time. I think there is something actually that still needs to be done. But this much time can take today. Absolutely. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us today on Business Nigeria. We sure will see you soon. Thank you.